Well, it is a fascinating idea, even for someone like myself who is not all that scientifically savvy. Some 20 years or so ago, two rather notable physicists, one from Harvard, one from MIT, Sidney Coleman and Alan Guth, suggested that beyond the three familiar dimensions of space, which are known to all of us, the dimensions of height and depth and width, and beyond what Einstein called the fourth dimension, the dimension of time, there is yet another set of parameters, a fifth dimension. It's not these guys, that was from the 60s, but a fifth dimension that is measured by the distance between good and evil, what we may call perhaps the moral dimension of life. What's more, just as every individual somehow exists within those first four dimensions of space and time, so each of us ultimately also has to live with an ethical dimension, whether we want to or not. When it comes right down to it, we're not just flesh and blood, are we? We're also body and soul. Now, right away, we should acknowledge that for a lot of people, the idea of a moral dimension in life is an uncomfortable one. Many will tell you this morning that each of us ought to be able to make our own rules in life. They've bought into a gospel of relativism, believing there are no real absolutes anymore, only an infinite number of self-interest. Only in the end, there's not really much hope. There's not really much happiness in that approach, I think. If there's nothing or no one around you to even tell you if what you're doing is ultimately good or not, it's a bit like the story of a novice parachutist who could not open his chute on the first jump. As he was falling to the ground, he saw another individual flying upward past him. So he called out, "Do you know anything about parachutes?" The man that was going past him yelled back, "No, do you know anything about gas stoves and hot air balloons?" When you have no rules in life, when you live only for the moment, not for eternity, when you try to become a law unto yourself, sooner or later you discover that it just doesn't work. The faster you end up going, the more you end up getting, the emptier you begin to feel inside. There's another way, however. For millennia ago, the one who made us laid out not just the sight lines of that moral dimension, but the blueprint for true happiness in life as well. From the smoky heights of the Jebel Musa or Mount Sinai, the creator of all life gave us 10 specific parameters for that covenant between himself and us. A top 10 list for living, in fact, long before top 10 lists became an overused idiom and expression. Now, it's true that scholars over the years have been arguing a little bit about how to divide and number those 10 commandments. Protestants have generally held to what is called the Philonic division. You can write that down as your new word for the day. Try to work it into the conversation at lunch if you can. The Philonic division separating the verses 2 and 3 from those in verses 4 to 6 here in Exodus 20, thus making the first and the second commandments, as we just read. And Catholics and Lutherans have followed the great early church fathers, Augustine in particular, in keeping all those verses together as but one command, and then splitting the last commandment in verse 17 about envying your neighbor's house and goods and coveting his wife into two separate words. In contrast, the Talmudic tradition of the Jews has kept that verse together, but it has separated verse 2 from verses 3 to 6, making the first commandment a kind of a preamble to all the rest. And the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, even puts the commandment about unfaithfulness, infidelity, and adultery before the one about murder. But since chapters weren't introduced in the Bible until 1227 AD, and verses were not specified until 1551 AD, you can pretty much divide them up however that you like. our theological and biblical basis for taking the first two commandments together this morning is based upon a careful study of the calendar and wanting to finish this sermon series by August 11. That's why we've done it. Likewise, some have pictured the two tablets that Moses, who apparently looked a lot like Charlton Heston, that the tablets he brought down from the mountain contained 5 commandments on each stone, even though the first verses containing the first 5 commandments are 4 times longer than those about the last half. Someone said, no, there were probably 3 or 4 commandments on one tablet. All those dealt with our relationship unto God, and then 6 or 7 on the other that deal with our relationship to each other. And if you want my take on it, I lean towards thinking there were 2 tablets, each of which had all 10 on them, because this was a covenant between God and his people, and God wanted a copy for each party. One which went into the Ark of the Covenant in the Holy of Holies, where God was said to dwell, that's his copy, and one which stayed out where the people of God could see it, that was our copy. Yet however you choose to order them, divide them, number them, display them, slice or dice them, in the end what matters the most is that we understand these words represent the word from God about how our lives are supposed to be conducted, not just in the context of the wilderness experience of the Hebrews. There's a whole other set of scriptures for that, but in the here and now of our everyday lives as well. Yeah, these words are ancient. That does not make them irrelevant. All the chronological snobbery that we have, we can choose to disregard them if we like. We can out and out disobey them if we decide to. We can cuss and discuss them until we're blue in the face looking for every loophole that we can find. We can dissect them critically and call it biblical scholarship if that makes us feel smart. But the one thing we can't do is simply dismiss them. See, Exodus 20, verse 1 makes it rather plain, doesn't it? It was God who spoke all these words. Not Moses, not Miriam, not any man, not any woman, not even a prophet. It was God. To put it another way, and I hate to say this on Father's Day, these are the directions for life. The instruction manual, if you will. And if God went to all the trouble to write them down for us, don't you suppose he meant for us to pay attention to them as well? See, the first 2 commandments, as we've numbered them, really strike right at the central issue. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself any images or idols to worship instead of me. No other gods before me is quite, when you translate out of the Hebrew, panah ayah, that means in front of me or before your panah, before your face. We could translate it into more common language to say, you shall have no other gods in your face but me. And why? Not simply because there are no other so-called gods out there, but because even if there were, none of them would be as worthy as our God, Yahweh Eloheka, the Lord our God. Now the Egyptians, out of whose nation those wandering Hebrews had come, had plenty of other gods to worship. They saw everything as entities which were indwelt by a spirit that could select its own form. As the Book of the Dead in Egypt catalogs for us, they had literally thousands of gods from which to choose. Osiris, for instance, was thought to be the source of the life-giving waters of the Nile. He was represented by the form of a bull, sort of an ancient Egyptian bevo, if you will. And Isis was the goddess of fertility, both for people and for crops. And if you didn't like either of them, there were gods with names like Seb and Set and Tim and Shu and Noom and Ptah and Hathor and Tefnut, and my personal favorite, just plain old Nut. So not only were oxen sacred, but so too were sheep and goats and lions and dogs and monkeys and cats and crocodiles and serpents and frogs and snakes and beetles and the stars of the night, the forces of fire and the light and air and darkness. They were all objects of Egyptian idolatry. Likewise, the land into which those runaway Hebrews were going, Canaan, was a place in which idolatry was also rampant. The Canaanites worshiped not only such deities as El, a heartless tyrant, and Baal, the god of the storms and of thunder, and Mot, the god of death. But they engaged in all kinds of pagan rites and rituals, including cult prostitution and even child sacrifices, carried out on the mountains or high places where they built their altars. Is it any wonder that as God prepared his covenant people of Israel to go in and take the promised land, that right at the very beginning he gave them this word, you shall not, you must not make, that is carve, cut, hem, you, out of wood, out of stone, out of any other material. You shall not make for yourself any idol or graven image in the form of anything in heaven above, or of the earth beneath, or of the waters below. You shall have no other gods before me. See, well, good thing that all ended with the Old Testament and the ancient Near East, right? Only for St. Paul, it didn't. As we read in Acts 17, while the apostle was in the city of Athens, he was greatly distressed to see the city was full of idols, he said, even including one shrine to the unknown God. And indeed, the first century world into which the Christian faith was born was so full of false gods and graven images that the beloved disciple John felt it necessary to write to his followers saying, "Dear children, keep yourself from idols." Or as one paraphrase puts it, from anything that might take God's place in your heart. And more to the point, despite all the centuries since then, idols are still problems in our own culture today. Now, I'm not referring to singers who want to be an American Idol. And I'm not referring to obviously inanimate objects. When we lived up in East Texas, some of the guys at my church one day came and they said, "Preacher, we have a softball team. Can we have a church rodeo team?" And being from Houston, I said, "Sure, go ahead." They formed one and they won the rodeo. And they brought back the trophy. They brought it into my office and said, "Where shall we put this?" You know what it was? A golden bull. I said, "Don't put it on the altar." Not those kind of idols. But when we reduce God down to a deity whom we can control or manipulate, when we seek to make God into our image, reflecting our judgments and preferences, rather than recognize we've been made into his image, designed to reflect his likeness into this world. Whenever we give to anything or anyone else, to a job, an activity, a hobby, or a person, the primary devotion and priority in our lives that is due to God and to God alone, we've committed idolatry, haven't we? It's a little like that old classic comedy routine Abbott and Costello did. Who's on First? About a mythical baseball team with players named Who and What and I don't know, who played first, second, and third base, respectively. Costello can never get what Abbott is telling him because he doesn't understand who's on first. A lot of folks today can't get their lives straight for the same reason, it seems. They fail to understand God alone is worthy of that ultimate loyalty in our lives, because it is to him that every one of us this morning live and move and have our being. Look again at how God identifies himself in verse 2. "I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Which is exactly where following false gods in life, falling into the sin of disobedience, always leads us into a bondage which we cannot escape by ourselves. Over the years of being a pastor, I've had countless people come into my study who have told me story after story about how their lives have been destroyed by sin and their own self-centeredness. Sometimes it has been through gambling or through alcoholism or through drug abuse or other types of behavior of addiction. Other times it stemmed from dysfunctional family relationships. Still others by patterns of infidelity that have cut across all the sacred bonds. I've never yet had a person tell me that if they could find a way out of their sin, that they wouldn't want to take it. Though following our own way always seems enticing to us, ultimately, in the end, well, Proverbs told us, there is a way that seems right unto man, but the end thereof is the way of death. Sin's always destructive, not just in our lives, but in the lives of those all around us. That's exactly why God gives us these words, I think. He wants us to understand there is a way out of the burdens of our lives. It comes from recognizing first that God alone is God, and second, from following the parameters and the pathways which these commandments have laid down for us. Let me be painfully plain this morning. The foundation and the source of that fifth moral dimension in life is rooted in the very nature of God himself. These are fundamental laws because God spoke them. They're not suggestions. They're not helpful hints. They're not guidelines. We can't manipulate them like bathroom scales where if you lean a little to the one side or the other, you get a more favorable reading. Right is what it is because God is who he is. He doesn't need our updates to make him more compatible to our culture. It's like the story of a ship's captain who one night at sea saw what looked like the lights of another ship coming towards them. So he had his signalman blink to the other ship, "Change your course 10 degrees south." The reply came back, "Change your course 10 degrees north." The ship's captain had him signal back, "I am a captain, we are a battleship, change your course south." And the answer came back, "I am a seaman first class, change your course north, I'm in the lighthouse." God is that lighthouse, my friends. And the commandments that he's given us, that we're going to look a little more closely at in the weeks ahead, are the signals to set our course in life so that we don't end up wrecked somewhere by sin on the shoals of the shoreline. You shall have no other gods before me. Lo lahaim, no other gods. Not one, nada, nothing, before, within, without. No rulers, no judges, no priorities, no bishops, no pastors, no lay delegates, no one before him. No personal preferences in your face, only him. That's the fifth dimension. I ask you, what are the idols in your life this morning? Throw them away and do it today. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, amen. We close singing How Deep the Father's Love for Us. I invite